For you, the listeners of JavaScript Jabber, Loot Crate is offering an opportunity to save 10% on any new subscription at lootcrate.com. Just enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings. Loot Crate is one of my favorite things. Every month I get a box in the mail, costs less than $20, and it comes with all kinds of goodies. I have stuff from, just looking at my shelf, Batman, Spider-Man, Ninja Turtles, Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and much, much more. So if you're a geek, a gamer, anything like that, and you want cool stuff to put around your office, cool t-shirts, comic books, etc., then definitely check out Loot Crate. To save 10% on your new subscription, go to lootcrate.com/Ruby. Again, that's lootcrate.com/Ruby to save 10% on any new subscription. Enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have Aimee Knight.
Hello from Nashville, Tennessee.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. One quick announcement, we are doing React Dev Summit. It's probably going to be around the same week that this comes out, so be aware of that. I'm also pulling together JavaScript Dev Summit, which is going to be in the middle of May, so go check that out at jsdevsummit.com. I'm also going to apologize briefly if my voice is a little scratchy. I got this terrible cold from my wife. I didn't get it as bad as she did, but I've definitely had my voice off and on this week. So anyway, we have a special guest this week, and that's Peggy Rayzis. Peggy, do you want to say hi?
Sure. Hey, everyone. This is Peggy Rayzis from the Apollo team, and I'm in Hoboken, New Jersey. So thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm super excited.
Awesome. Well, about a year and 2 months ago, we did an episode about Apollo and GraphQL with Uri Goldstein. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Funny enough, when I went and looked it up, Aimee and I were the two panelists that were on that one too. So I guess we're the GraphQL people for JavaScript Jabber, right, Aimee?
Yes, I can't believe it was like that long ago. It seems like, I don't know, a year and a half, and it seems like it was 6 months ago. But yes, I have a slew of questions for this episode too.
Awesome. Before we get there though, Peggy, do you want to just give a little bit more of an introduction, like who you work for, what your background is, why you're famous, your favorite flavor of ice cream? I don't know, anything you want to put out there.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an open source engineer on the Apollo team, where I do a variety of things. I feel like as an open source engineer, no 2 days are ever the same. Sometimes I'm reviewing pull requests. Sometimes I'm creating blog posts or other forms of content, giving workshops. So it's really exciting. I primarily focus on client stuff and working on our most popular tool, Apollo Client, and then also some of our other libraries like Apollo Link and Apollo Link State. And before that, I was a UI engineer at Major League Soccer, where I did primarily React and React Native work, and also saw our transition from REST to GraphQL. And favorite flavor of ice cream is tough because I really love ice cream. So I don't really discriminate between chocolate and vanilla, but cookies and cream would probably be my go-to.
Way to go. Awesome. So let's talk about Apollo and GraphQL. Now, some people are going to have heard the past episode and some won't. So let's just give kind of a 5-minute elevator pitch on what GraphQL is and what Apollo is, so people kind of have some context, and then we can dig in a little deeper.
Absolutely. So GraphQL at its core is really a typed query language. It was developed by Facebook, and it allows you to describe your data requirements in a declarative way. So you can kind of contrast this with REST, for example. If you're hitting a particular resource like an articles endpoint, you're just going to get all the data that comes back from that endpoint, whether or not you plan on using it in your UI. With GraphQL, you can actually describe the particular fields that you want from that article's endpoint. So say you're only using the title and the author, for example, you'll get back an array of article objects with only a title and an author property. So this is really great because it allows for faster development on the front end, smaller payloads, and just a really excellent developer experience. So that's GraphQL, the language, but oftentimes when we say GraphQL, we're referring to this huge ecosystem of tools that's really exploded in the past couple of years that help you integrate GraphQL into your application. So
can I interrupt you really quickly?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
So I've been talking to some new people, and they're like, can you just get some definitions in some of the stuff that people throw out there? And you said something like typed query language. Can you just give people a background on what that is so that they can understand a little bit better? And then we can dig into the ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I say that GraphQL is a typed query language, everything is statically typed. So when you are first integrating GraphQL on the server, you're going to define a schema, and that's like a blueprint for your data. And everything is typed, and when you make a GraphQL request, your request is then validated against those types. And then in order to define the fields, you have resolvers, which are how you actually fetch the data from a REST endpoint or a database or another GraphQL API. Did that answer your question?
I think so. I think one clarification is that if you ask for an article, you get an article object, which is something you said, but I don't know if the two ideas got tied together. And then the other thing is an article object can have stuff underneath it. So it can have maybe number of views or the body of the article or things like that. And those are also typed. And so you can expect what you get. Whereas with REST, usually you just get a big blob of data and you have to know how it goes together on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the typing actually makes for a lot of really excellent developer tools. If you've ever played around with GraphQL, for example, you have that documentation on Explorer on the side, which gives you full visibility into everything that's going on with your schema, the different types, how you can query for those types. And then it also features autocomplete as well, which makes for a really excellent developer experience.
Awesome. And it looks like AJ joined us. AJ, do you want to say hello?
Hello. I also want to ask, where do the schemas get defined? Is that like in the top header of the object, it says, here's a link to the schema, or?
So your schema is defined on your GraphQL server and typically defined in schema definition language or SDL if you're using GraphQL tools and Apollo server together. You can also kind of define it manually using GraphQL JS if you'd like, but schema definition language is definitely the more intuitive way to go that we see most people building their GraphQL servers with.
Yeah, you can turn that feature on and off with most GraphQL backends, where you can query and see what the schema is, but it's a really, really handy way to quickly understand what you're dealing with. All right, so I'm sorry I interrupted you. You were going into GraphQL ecosystem, and I think Aimee has a question about that when we get into it.
Keep going for a little bit.
Okay, sounds good. So speaking about the GraphQL ecosystem, there's so many different tools that are out there in order to help you implement GraphQL into your application. But since I work at Apollo, I'm going to recommend the Apollo stack, which is kind of our full stack family of tools that help make GraphQL really approachable. So on the back end, you have Apollo server, and that's our implementation of a GraphQL server in Node. And it features all of the latest extension points like tracing and cache control. So it's really intuitive, easy to use. You can use it with Express or Happy or, even AWS Lambda if you prefer. So tons of extension points out there. So when you're defining your GraphQL schema on your server, then you would use GraphQL tools, which is our package that I was talking about earlier that allows you to define your schema using schema definition language and then to write your resolvers in a very intuitive way. And then on the front end, once you have your GraphQL server, you need to connect it to your UI somehow. So you have Apollo Client, which is our GraphQL client that really provides a cohesive data story for your application. So it caches your data for you. It handles really complex features like pagination and optimistic UI, and it tracks the loading states and the error states of your queries. And then from there, to hook it up to your view layer, you would use one of our integration packages. Apollo Client actually works with React, it works with Angular, Vue, or even vanilla JavaScript. We actually have a Reason ML package as well. So that's how you bind your queries to your UI is through our view layer integrations.
Awesome. You used a couple of terms. Sorry, Aimee, I'm going to preempt you for a second. That I'm also not familiar with. So you talked about tracing and cache control. Do you want to talk about those really quickly on the Apollo server?
Yeah, so tracing and cache control are really new. These are extension points that are sent back with the GraphQL response that then you can use in our GraphQL API gateway called Apollo Engine to visualize the performance data of your resolvers, and then also to set cache hints on your GraphQL response, which you're then able to visualize in Apollo Engine as well.
Awesome.
Okay, so in preparation for the episode, I was reading a bunch of stuff because I've just been having like a lot of conversations recently actually at work about how this might actually benefit us, and just like scanning through Hacker News this morning, there was an article that was kind of clickbaity, but how GraphQL replaces Redux, and while the person who wrote the article is like saying it wasn't necessarily that they got rid of Redux entirely, it cut down on a lot of their like front end state management logic. By switching to GraphQL. So I'd be curious if you can kind of talk about that, because it sounds like you have some experience in that firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I worked at Apollo, I worked at Major League Soccer, where I saw our organization's transition from REST to GraphQL. And
Go Real Salt Lake.
So previously we were using REST and Redux for our data fetching. But once we switched to Apollo Client, we were able to see all this code surrounding aggregating data from our different REST endpoints and tracking things like error and loading state just melt away by switching to Apollo Client, since it handles all of that for you out of the box. And when you kind of think about the different reducers that you have in your application, I'd guarantee that most of them are probably related to remote data fetching. So once that's all removed and Apollo Client's taking care of all of that for you, you're really only left with just a little bit for client state. So we actually released a package earlier this year called Apollo Link State that allows you to handle your local data inside Apollo Client and store it in the Apollo cache alongside your remote data, which is super exciting because now people can completely eliminate Redux from their applications if they'd like to, and then just use their Apollo cache as their single source of truth for all the data in their application. So even though that post title seems a little bit clickbaity, it's definitely something that's entirely possible with the Apollo ecosystem of tools that we have today.
I love deleting code. You talk about deleting code, that makes me smile.
It's a good feeling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd say that the best code is no code, because you don't have to maintain it. You don't have to think about it. And, it's just so nice that Apollo Client kind of takes care of all those things for you. It allows just for so much greater developer productivity in my experience. At least when I was a UI engineer, it definitely helped us iterate a lot quicker, and to also reuse code between platforms, because we no longer had to like duplicate tons of logic between our React and our React Native apps. We could just kind of share all our Apollo containers across platforms.
Does the conversation change if you're not using Redux, or if you're in a different ecosystem like maybe Angular or Vue or some of these other front end systems?
I don't think so. So the Angular store implementation, NGRX, we've heard from a lot of people who are Apollo Angular users who were able to stop using NGRX for their data management. We've heard the same story for Vue users and Vuex. So I think, regardless of what front-end framework you're using, I think a lot of people have found great success eliminating a lot of complexity from their applications by switching to Apollo.
Yeah, NGRX is based on Redux and uses the Redux pattern. So that's not a surprise, but sometimes things change and you not in the ways you expect. So I was curious there. AJ, it looks like you've got a couple of questions. You want to chime in?
Yeah, so in the same vein, I'm wondering, when is the right time to use this and when is it not? Because it's GraphQL, so that would imply that it's when you're working with graph structured data, it sounds like it's a perfect fit. But what if you're not working with graph structured data? Or like, when is it that I should anticipate I should go ahead and make the move? And when is it that I should say, you know what I have works just fine for my use case?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a common misconception about GraphQL that you have to be working with graph-shaped data in order to get benefits from it. I would say that the people who get the greatest benefits from GraphQL are people with maybe a lot of different microservices with REST endpoints, or just a lot of different data sources that need to be aggregated into a single object to be consumed on the client. That's something that GraphQL does really well, because you specify kind of the logic for fetching the different data sources in your resolvers, but they could be from anywhere. They could be from a REST endpoint or a database. It doesn't matter. It's kind of how you combine them in your schema. So I would say that your data definitely doesn't have to be graph shaped, or you don't have to be using GraphQL APIs in your resolvers to get the most benefit. You can be just calling regular REST endpoints in your resolvers.
So it sounds like the way that you're talking about GraphQL is really as a backend service that's aggregating other backend services. So I'm integrating my Twitter feed with my Facebook feed, with my Instas, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of where it shines. And it's also a lot of people's first exposure to GraphQL. Maybe they don't have a GraphQL API over their database set up just yet. A lot of people have REST endpoints. It's a really easy way to just start incrementally using GraphQL into your application, is just to start small, maybe with like one feature, build out a schema, and then just start calling the REST endpoints that you already have.
So one of the things that I would like when I think of graph data, like true graph data, I think of Facebook, right? Because it is, what popularized graph data on the web, in that you have this relationship of you're a friend that has friends, of which each friend has friends, of which each friend has friends, of which each friend, and so on. So how do you get the benefit of being able to get a true graph structure like that without downloading the entire internet?
Yeah, you can definitely see where it spirals out of control. There's some packages that you can use on the back end to help clean up some of those calls to your endpoints, one of which is Data Loader, which kind of batches and caches calls to your different endpoints to avoid just like hitting them over and over again in a single request. So we definitely recommend using that. But I'd also recommend too analyzing your schema. We have our GraphQL API gateway called Apollo Engine that allows you to analyze really detailed tracing data for your resolvers and to see how long your requests are taking. So by analyzing that data, you can kind of avoid these recursive situations, or situations where you're calling your endpoints way too many times for a single request.
So is there like a way to specify depth? I want all friends with no duplicates up to 3 layers or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is an extension, and I am blanking on the name right now, but Max Stoiber wrote a really excellent blog post on GraphQL security, an extension he used to specify the depth of his requests. I'll send you guys the link so you can link to it in the episode. But
Awesome.
Yeah, using packages like that is a really great way to avoid like deeply recursive data structures.
So I have a question backing up a little bit more. If a team wanted to like implement this, how would people go about like starting small with an existing application? Like what do you need to consider before you incorporate it? Like, and then how can you take the most baby steps to go about it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. I feel like we get that one all the time just because GraphQL seems really intimidating at first. But I would advise anyone who's looking to bring GraphQL into their organization to really just start small and pick maybe like one feature, one reducer if you're using Redux, for example, and then to just build a very simple GraphQL server and to just detail out a schema for one particular feature. And then on the client side, once you have that server, you can use our new package, Apollo Boost, which all you have to do is just like pass the URI of your GraphQL server and it'll set it up all for you. And you'll literally, I was teaching a workshop last week in London. people were set up and making their first queries within 10 minutes. So I would say to just start small, start with one feature, and just incrementally convert over those features to GraphQL. And I think you'll find, like, once people start doing it, that it seems a little weird when they're first using it, especially if they're coming from more of a Redux and REST background. But people really start to love it, and then you gradually start to convert over more and more features.
When you start a new project, typically you need things like a domain name, hosting, things like that. When I choose hosting, I pick mine for the options it gives. I like to know what I'm getting and set things up just how I like them. This is why, for your projects, you should check out Linode. Linode servers feature native SSD storage, a 40 gigabyte network, and Intel E5 processors. That's all the power you need to run VMs under full control, or Docker containers, who doesn't love that, encrypted disks, and VPNs. Plus, they have 10 data centers across the world and add-ons like backups, Node Balancer, and Longview to help you control your server costs. They also offer block storage for your static files, and you can get started with a $20 credit if you use the code JavaScript Jabber 2018. That credit is good for 4 months on their 1 gigabyte server. That's a lot of time to try them out and see if they're the right fit for you. That code again is JavaScript Jabber 2018. Also, if you're interested in working for Linode, they're hiring. Head to linode.com/careers to see their available positions.
One other thing that I've done in playing with GraphQL is just do a little bit of setup on like GraphQL or Prisma or Scaffold, which is with a PH. You play with some of these back-end as a service systems, and then you don't have to worry about the back-end system. And then, then you can just kind of work your way in with a small project like Peggy's recommending.
Yeah, absolutely. GraphQL, they've been really great contributors to the GraphQL community. They actually, I think they've had it for a little bit, but have just started to publicize their GraphQL boilerplates GitHub repository, which has some starter projects so people can easily get started with GraphQL.
Yep. So one thing that I wind up talking a lot to people about, and this is because I live a lot in the back end. So on the front end, you've got Apollo and you've got, Relay or something like that. You're pulling from a GraphQL API, but when you're setting up a GraphQL API, the conversation changes a little bit, because now it's, how do I get all of my data formatted into the right format? Do you want to talk a little bit about how Apollo Server works, and then we can dig into maybe some of the other implementations that are out there?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. Apollo Server is our GraphQL server implementation for Node, and it works with a variety of different backend frameworks, the most popular being Express. And it's literally only a couple lines of code, and you can get your GraphQL server started up pretty much instantaneously. And then from there, as you're writing your schema, you'll probably be using our package GraphQL tools, which allows you to build out your schema using schema definition language, and then write your resolvers as well.
That makes sense. One thing that I'm curious about is, so I have some systems that I'm building, and part of me thinks, oh, well, I should just, build the API with the REST setup that's in Rails or whatever I'm using. But then part of me thinks, okay, well, I have a database here, and Express can connect to that database. So could I just set up like a separate service that's my API service with Apollo Server?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of companies have kind of set up a separate GraphQL service to aggregate the data from their various databases and other microservices. So that's definitely a popular route to take.
Yeah, make you guys do all the work. Yeah, I've also worked on a little bit of GraphQL stuff on the back end with the Ruby GraphQL gem. And I know that there are similar packages. You talked about Apollo Server. And so what usually winds up going on is you have resolvers. I think that's what they're called on the back end. And, essentially what happens then is you set up some kind of class or object that does the work of formatting it. And I'm assuming that's what Apollo does in Apollo Server on its back end, is it just contains the resolvers and gives you an easy way to set all that stuff up.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right. Obviously with JavaScript, you don't have to worry about like statically typing your models as you would in other languages. But yeah, Apollo Server makes it really easy to just set everything up.
I'll definitely have to check that out. I'm curious to, once you get into using something like Apollo or GraphQL on your front end, I like to test my systems. How much of that do you really need to do with GraphQL? Because when I look at what you put in and what you get back, it's fairly intuitive. And so part of me is thinking, I don't necessarily need to test that. And part of me is thinking, you have to test everything. So, I mean, what kind of an approach do you take there?
Yeah, so definitely one of the approaches that people use is, mocking out their GraphQL server and mocking out their resolver functions. That's a popular approach. Also, snapshot testing and Jest is a really great way to kind of test the responses that you're getting. So I would say those are probably the two most popular ways to test.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not sure exactly how. I haven't used Jest. What does the snapshot testing do?
It's amazing. So it allows you to essentially take a snapshot, and this could be of anything. It could be of a GraphQL response. It could be, any sort of anything that's serializable, really. And it'll take that snapshot and it'll store it for you. And then the next time you run that test, it'll test the result against that stored snapshot, and then it'll be able to show you the diff. So it's a really easy way to get a lot of test coverage. I feel like I just snapshot all of the things in my projects just because it's so nice and intuitive to use. I highly recommend giving it a try.
Yeah, it sounds like there was a gem in Ruby called VCR, and you would essentially, if you had a third-party API you were hitting, it would make the request and then store the response in what they called a cassette, was just a JSON file. And then, it would just compare what you got back the next time with what was in the JSON file and make sure it all lined up if you were testing it that way. But it would also allow you to use those cassettes so you didn't have to do an end run to the API server every time you were doing your tests. And so it would use those as a mock for the API server.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds really cool.
So are there big companies out there using GraphQL? I mean, besides Facebook kind of invented it, but are there other folks out there that are using it, other big users of Apollo that have kind of an interesting use case that you're aware of?
Yeah, so a lot of companies, large and small, are using GraphQL in production. The New York Times recently switched over last year from Relay to Apollo. They wrote a really excellent blog post about their experience there. Ticketmaster is another big company, CNBC. We have tons of them on our website. And then, even ranging down to smaller startups, all these companies, both large and small, have found a lot of success with GraphQL.
Gotcha. That's awesome. So Aimee asked, what's the best way to get started? I'm a little curious. Is there documentation somewhere on the internet that is a good place for people to go when they try this out and maybe run into a little snag here or there? Yeah.
So in terms of tutorials, howtographql.com is a website set up by GraphQL that has a lot of interactive exercises and videos for both the front end and the back end that a lot of people use when they're just starting out. I'm actually going to be having an Egghead course released in the next couple months on Apollo Client. So that'll be a really great resource for people that are just starting out. What else? We have some blog posts on Medium, a full stack GraphQL tutorial that kind of walks you through the whole process of creating your first Apollo server and then hooking it up to Apollo Client. So there's definitely a wealth of information out there on how to get started. It's just scattered everywhere throughout the internet. I guess it kind of depends on your learning style too, whether you're more of a blog post learner or video learner, and also workshops too. We're starting some in-person workshops with Ryan Florence and his workshop.me company. So be on the lookout for those as well.
Awesome. Well, congrats on the Egghead course and the workshop.me stuff. I've talked to Ryan about that. All of that is great stuff and terrific people behind those companies.
Yeah, absolutely. We're super excited to partner with them on that.
Yep. Okay, one last thing that I'm curious about, and this is more just kind of personal curiosity. The Apollo library is put together by the Meteor Development Group. And so I'm curious, is this what Meteor is using behind the scenes now? Because I still have people say, oh, I'm using Meteor for all of my web development. It's awesome. And I know they had their own kind of proprietary protocol for that. Have they moved everything over to Apollo and GraphQL then?
So I think Apollo was kind of born out of, some of the frustrations, I guess, with handling data and Meteor, and it was kind of inspired by that. There's actually, surprisingly not too many examples of integrating Meteor and Apollo. I know they're definitely trying to make that easier. But yeah, Apollo is, definitely separate, but we are using it internally on some of our tools like Galaxy, which is our Meteor hosting service. So we're definitely using it at the company.
Awesome. And that's not what the show is about, but Meteor's cool stuff too. So definitely check it out as well. All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks.
This episode is sponsored by Codacy. If you want to improve code quality, prevent bugs, and secure liabilities for making it into your production, and at the same time speed up your code review process by 20%, then you need to try Codacy. Codacy makes it easy to track code quality and code coverage, and to identify and fix issues by automatically checking your commits and pull requests against all the most widely used static analysis tools. Codacy helps build great teams that build great software, so join companies like Delivery Hero, PayPal, Samsung, and more, and try it for free through GitHub or Bitbucket. If you use the code JSJabber at checkout, you will get a 10% discount. That's Codacy, CODACY.com.
AJ, do you want to start us off with picks?
Sure. So there's one I have not mentioned in a long time is simple.com. So I have an online bank account with simple.com, and their interface is just really slick and clean to use. And one cool thing that happens is when you sign up with them, and I don't know if they still do this. I think they give you a wallet of some sort. I don't know if it's the wallet that I got when I first signed up, but they give you this wallet that's basically a chipboard, or cardboard or paperboard or whatever you want to call it. The technique is called chipboard, I found out. Separator where you put cards on one side and cash on the other, and a number 84 blue rubber band, which goes around horizontally rather than vertically like a broccoli rubber band would. And I've enjoyed that for many moons. And so much so that I actually decided to get the specs for how to make them and do that. So I also have a site up now. It's broccoliwallet.com where if you want to get one of those, you can get one. And I'm also going to pick again the book that I've been listening to, The Four. It's about Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple. It's a very interesting read. It's got a little bit, it's a business book. So they use business language, like the F word every so many times a chapter, which I'm a little sad about. I wish that they'd keep it clean so you could play it around children and whatnot. But the concepts of the book about how these four giant companies have been built and what's going on with them, what their secret motives are and how they've developed and stuff. Some of it's a little conspiracy theory, but it's probably true. And it's just a fun book and really interesting. So those are my picks.
Awesome. Aimee, what are your picks?
Okay, so the first one, I'm going to go ahead and pick that article I mentioned, how GraphQL replaces Redux, and I'll put a link for that in the show notes. And then the other one, if you are in the LA area, they are looking for speakers for the JavaScript meetup there. They reached out to me, but unfortunately I don't have any plans to be in LA this year that I know of yet. Anyway, so yeah, if you're in the area, I'll put a link and you can contact the organizers. It sounds like they have a pretty good meetup there that you would want to check out. And that is it for me.
Awesome. I'm going to chime in with a couple of picks. The first one is basically just if you're looking for some way of implementing GraphQL in whatever language you're in, just do a Google search for it. There are libraries now for just about everything. So, my language of choice on the back end is still Ruby. So, I go pick up the GraphQL-Ruby gem. Works great. But yeah, this is something that's approachable for everybody pretty much on any stack. There's also a WordPress GraphQL plugin, And so I'm going to pick that. I haven't done anything with it yet, but it looks really interesting. So I'm going to pick that as well. And then my wife and kids and I have all been playing a board game that I've been really enjoying. Yeah, I'm taking over for Joe, picking a board game. But we've been playing the Hogwarts Battles. It's actually a deck building game. It's more of a card game than a board game. But it's been a ton of fun, and just teaching my kids how to play it. My 8-year-old can play it. My 6-year-old, it's a little bit complicated for him, but my 8-year-old can play it. My 10-year-old can play it. My 12-year-old can play it. So, and my wife can play it. So, if you're worried about old people too. My wife's 3 years older than I am, so I always give her a bad time about being old. But anyway, we've had a good time playing it as a family, and so I'm going to pick that. My sister and her husband have also been coming over every other week, and we've been playing Pandemic Legacy. If you're not familiar with the Legacy games, they're basically, you play through them about a dozen times or so, and the last game influences the next game, and there's a progression that you go through, and then at the end of the game, you're done with the game. Like, you can't play it again because you've torn up cards and marked up your board and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, it's been really, really fun. We're looking at getting the Pandemic Legacy season 2, which looks like it'll be fun. And I also have a board game group that I get together with every month. And I just bought Risk Legacy. And so I'm going to probably set up a second board game night every night with those guys to just play Risk Legacy every month. So anyway, really enjoy the board games. But yeah, those are my picks. Peggy, what are your picks?
Sure. So I kind of already talked about one of my picks already, but my first one is workshop.me. And that is a new series of workshops led by Ryan Florence. And literally every single expert in the JavaScript community is giving a workshop. So if you want to learn about animations in Vue, you can learn one directly from Sarah Drasner. If you want to learn about Gatsby, you have the creator of Gatsby, Kyle, teaching a workshop on that. So definitely check out the page. There's tons of workshops in cities all over the country teaching just about everything that you want to learn. And shameless plug, I'm going to actually be giving a full stack GraphQL workshop in June in New York City with some more dates following in the summer and the fall. So yeah, definitely check that out. If you're looking to learn something new, because there's tons of great workshops on there. And then my second pick would be, it's actually a book. It's called Thanks for the Feedback. And I talked about it in my talk that I gave in London this past week, but it's really helped me as an open source engineer just kind of deal with giving and receiving feedback in a more productive way. So I think as an open source engineer, you're constantly dealing with feedback from people and giving and receiving feedback in pull requests and on blog posts and on social media from people in the community. So it's definitely been really formative for me as I just try to see each negative feedback experience as a positive one and how I can learn from it. So yeah, it's definitely influenced how we've been interacting with contributors, and I highly recommend anyone who's an open source maintainer or just someone who wants to improve at giving and receiving feedback to check it out.
Awesome. One other thing that a lot of people like to do is they like to follow our guests. So do you have a Twitter account or GitHub account or blog or anywhere else where you put information that people can go to follow what you're working on these days?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am all over the internet at Peggy Rayzis, Twitter, GitHub, Medium, all of the above. So yeah, I can link to that. And yeah, definitely follow me if you like React and GraphQL related tweets.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for coming, Peggy. I think this is a really interesting direction that we're going to see more and more APIs going in. And so your work is important, I think, to a lot of different people going forward. So thank you. And thank you to the team that puts together Apollo.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. This has been super fun.
All right, folks, we will wrap this up and we will catch you all next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.